So hello everyone and welcome to Ensuring Learning Guided Pathways and Learning Outcomes Assessment. I am Dr. Sarah Harris. I'm a member of the Academic Senate for California Community Colleges Guided Pathways Taskforce. And I'm also a Pathways Liaison and an Outcomes Assessment Coordinator and a Curriculum Coordinator on my campus, the College of the Sequoias. So thank you so much for having us. We're excited to chat with you here today. We also have Jeffrey Hernandez, who's one of our Senate Pathways Task Force leads from East Los Angeles College. Hi, Jeffrey. And we have Stephanie Curry, who's also, again, a member of that task force, and she's with Reedley College. Jeannie Mae is not able to join us today. She had a time conflict, but we miss her and we'll soldier on without her. So you may have seen her in the program, but she's not able to join us today. All right. So let's go ahead and get rolling. You've probably seen the description of the session in your program, but just in case, today you're going to hear from some members of the statewide Senate Guided Pathways Task Force. So we have kind of come together to talk with you a little bit about learning outcomes assessment and how it fits within the Guided Pathways framework, particularly that fourth pillar of ensuring learning. We're going to talk about resources for integrating assessment throughout pathways. We'll give you some cool examples of how that's happening at a couple of colleges. And then also about how the integration of learning outcomes assessment can lead to strong and equitable learning outcomes for students. So you'll hear a little bit about the task force and the work that we're doing, and then we're going to get into some cool examples and hopefully just have a lot of dialogue and discussion with you all. And so before we get started, we're interested to know how many of the folks we have with us today are involved with Guided Pathways work on your campus. So if you are involved with that pathways work in some way, would you please just raise your hand or use a party reaction if you want? That's fun too, but let's just see how many folks we have with us who are doing that work. Awesome. Love those numbers going up. 2 partiers. Hello, partiers. I love it. Yeah, it looks like about dozen, 20 or so of us. Those reactions do go away pretty fast now, so that's a bummer, but cool. All right, excited to have you all with us. And so particularly for folks who are doing the work, the examples and the resources that we're going to share hopefully will be helpful for you as you're thinking about this kind of integration work on your own campuses. But please feel free to chime in with examples or ideas for how things are happening where you are. We're excited to hear about those. All right, so just a brief overview for those who might not be familiar of the statewide Senate's Guided Pathways Task Force. We are a group with several goals. Primarily, we are working on the integration of pathways into the Senate's structures. So we are a task force. We won't exist forever. At some point, the work of pathways will exist kind of throughout the statewide Senate committees. And many of you are maybe doing similar work right now on your own campuses. We look at evaluating pathways and placement. You may have seen some recent papers from the statewide Senate about AB 705 and how that's kind of proceeding throughout the state. We've been working on projects related to that, analyzing data about placement for students. We work to amplify equity work, which you're going to hear us talk a little bit about today, to focus on ensuring learning. Again, that really critical component, right, of the work that we do, all of us, for students. And then assess and improve program review and related processes. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we feel like outcomes assessment fits within potentially program review or similar processes that you probably already have and are doing on your campuses. Okay, so that's the task force. Anything, Jeff or Stephanie, you want to add about that?
Well, I think that covers it. I think and this, I think, as you point out, this sort of integration into our existing practice at the state level is what we're all looking at the local level too, particularly by the end of next year.
Great. Okay. All right. So on to guided pathways in general. Again, we have a lot of folks who are doing that work, so I'm going to be quick with this slide. But if you're not familiar, guided pathways is really a kind of a framework that exists to sort of orient all of our work at our colleges and our districts around student success and student goals, right? It's about designing with the students in mind. And so rather than think of it as a separate initiative, we like to think about it as a way of organizing our work, right? Or reorganizing it in many cases in order to kind of focus on students and their learning. Something that I think most of us as outcomes assessment professionals would recognize, hopefully, right? That particular goal and get excited about. So the 4 pillars, of course, we'll talk about in a minute. You have the sort of display there. But in terms of where we are at the statewide level with kind of the Pathways Initiative, we're rolling towards the end of the funding. We're in, I think, year 3 now. And 4, Stephanie, thank you, year 4, see, woof. I've lost all track of, linear time, I think. This current state that we're in, year 4. So every year, your campus is going to be doing a scale of adoption report that talks about the implementation of the design components, the 4 pillars of pathways at scale, where you are in terms of how far along in scaling your various adoptions. I mention this because this report typically goes through your academic senate. Your senate president needs to sign off on it. So if you're not sure about where your campus or your district is with pathways, there should be some kind of report that will let you know what the campus is working on and where you are at various stages of implementation. You can follow up with your senate or with your pathways groups on campus to sort of learn a little bit about that work. Final pathways funds from the chancellor's office.
Sarah, can I just?
Yes, please,
Yeah.
Stephanie. Go ahead.
I just want to put in, there are specific questions on the SOAA or the scale of adoption that we do that are about outcome assessment and assessment of those other things. So if you're not in conversation with your Guided Pathways group about what you guys are doing on there and what scale you guys are at for that, that's a really good opportunity because there actually are questions specifically in there about outcomes.
That's great, Stephanie. Thank you. And jump in anytime, either of you. Stop me.
Sarah, I wanted to just chime in. In some ways, it does feel like 3 years in, right? Because we didn't get the funding till the end of the first year, right? So a lot of our activities, seems like, boy, we're being judged in 4 years and 3 years. But unfortunately, I think we're all seeing this with learning outcomes assessment in other areas. A lot of the guided pathways of startup work has been ongoing, and now we're again ramping that up and having further integration.
That's true. And it will continue to be ongoing, which I think we'll talk about, right? But in terms of funding, we know that the final funds will be allocated from the state in July of 21, the end of this year. And then they need to be expended by June of next year. So a lot of campuses have been reserving some of that funds, right, in order to continue to expend it. And so it may be that on your campus, you continue to have funding through next year. Again, it just depends on what kind of adoption plan folks have been using. Any other chime in about funds, folks? That's pretty much the nuts and bolts there.
The other thing is, talk to your people. If there's a project you want to do to help, faculty do assessments and do things like that, talk to your Guided Pathways people about creating some sort of funding source for it, because there is funding, for each of those colleges, depending on what they've already spent. It's a good opportunity to ask. And if you're looking for some sort of project to be able to fund, it's an opportunity to have a discussion about that.
Absolutely. And as we'll see, especially when we talk about ensuring learning, right? Outcomes assessment is a natural fit, and you probably have a lot of great assessment projects that are going to fit neatly in that particular pillar, although it's infused throughout. So one last thing I wanted to highlight is that in the Chancellor's Office own sort of FAQ about pathways initiatives and funding, they refer to it as an iterative process, right? Planning, analyzing, reflection, revision of plans. So we're never necessarily all the way done with pathways. We're always kind of iterating and thinking through our plans and improving them and collecting data. And again, if you're an assessment person, that should sound familiar, because
Yes.
Guess what? That's how outcomes assessment works, right? We're always kind of collecting data and iterating and improving instruction and all those things. So pathways in that way is very, very similar.
Well, and we've actually talked about, we use student learning outcomes as an example of how to do that. An outcomes assessment. Like we're talking about like this, we're going to do this. Well, yeah, we're going to try it. We're going to see what we're going to do. And we're going to evaluate it like we do in our classrooms and our outcomes and things like that. So we've actually used it as something similar to what our guided pathways processes are doing, working on.
Yeah. And that emphasis on continuous quality improvement is really why it's helpful to think about guide pathways not as an initiative, but as its framework, a mindset that is helping redesign what we do.
Absolutely. Okay. And so to that end, I wanted to briefly pause and talk a little bit about backwards design, because this is a thing I share a lot, just as an example on my own campus. The idea that outcomes can be used to design learning experiences that are intentional, clear, and center on what students can do. So probably many of you are familiar with this. This is an instructional design kind of concept that's been around for a long time, but just an approach to teaching and curriculum design attributed to Wiggins and McTighe most primarily, and that references in the end of the slides if you would like it to that book. But most instructional design starts with the content, right? We know when people are thinking about planning a course, they're like, oh, what are the sections in my textbook? And then I'm going to teach those sections, and then I'll give maybe an exam or something, right? And then we move sort of from there. And backwards design says, of course, start at the other end. What's the kind of goal, the learning outcome, right, for your curriculum? And then what do we need to do to determine whether or not students are meeting that goal? What kinds of assessments are appropriate in the classroom? And then what content do we need to go over in order to prepare students for that assessment? So we talk about this a lot on my campus. I think it's a really useful framework for understanding how outcomes and how learning goals can guide curriculum and instruction, right? How they should do that.
Sarah, I just want to point out again, this is I'm trained as a librarian, so I'm from the other side of the the 50% law in the non-instructional area. And what we've learned is this design model that we use for outcomes in classes works really well with other areas as well. So student support and some of those other areas. So anything we do with our guided pathways elements, we're always talking about outcomes first. Like, what is the outcome of this activity that we want to do? What is the outcome of this? And then we have to try to address how we're going to quantify it, either qualitative or quantify it, and do that backwards design. And that's really been a shift in our thinking in outside the classroom in these areas. And I think we've used this classroom experience of the outcomes to kind of shift our experience in that.
Absolutely, Stephanie, and that's where I was just going to go, right? So backwards design, guided pathways, excuse me, functionally is backwards design for our institutions, right? That's what it is. So if we know it from the classroom, let's pull that out and do it at the sort of larger level and at scale at the institution. And so if we think about designing with that end in mind in terms of pathways, right, we've got our 4 pillars: clarify, enter, stay, ensure learning. And we can think about outcomes as a model for how to sort of fit into each of those pillars. So in terms of clarifying the path, if we're designing with that end in mind, program learning outcomes are a clear fit, right? Starting with those outcomes that are clearly tied to students' goals can help students to understand what pathway is most appropriate for them and where they're going to fit in, right? What's my learning goal? What's my career goal? Where is the place that I should kind of start with that? If we're entering the path, we can think about, again, clearly communicating those program goals to help students choose. So if we have really compelling and strong program learning outcomes that make sense to students, then they're much more able to choose, right, a pathway or a program that's going to be engaging and interesting to them. And I saw in the chat a little while back, we had a question about, right, our old SLOs feel uncompelling in this new world. Is there any advice on redeveloping outlines, perhaps with students or local research collaboration? And yes, right, we're going to actually see a couple of examples of that in a little bit here, particularly around CTE and using kind of community input. But again, right, that idea of your program learning outcomes being a place where students can clearly see their goals is, I think, a good place to start that conversation. Staying on the path means, again, like aligning your course and program learning goals so students can see their progress, right? Again, helping them to stay on the path so that they see where they are and where they need to go, so that they can see that they have made progress and get excited about it versus just like, oh, I'm checking boxes, right? No, you've learned important skills, even if you're only kind of part way through, and you can come back and pick those skills up again if that's something that you need to do. And then, of course, ensure learning, right, which is building that learning across your curriculum, measuring student progress to identify and fill any gaps that you might find. And of course, SLO assessment fits most neatly here. I also want to mention that, of course, pillars 1 through 3, particularly if you are on the student services side, service area outcomes are also really critical for this work, right? To make sure that we are serving all of our students, that they have good access to information, that they have good supports. All of those things also are really clearly aligned with the pillars of pathways. And Jeffrey, were you going to add?
Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth. This is the services, yes, definitely. And I was thinking about how Stephanie was reminding us of the SOA work that we're doing right now, and one of the things that you'll note, right, is that the practices of Pillar 2 in particular, right, aligning with the sort of student service outcomes that you may have at your institutions.
Okay. So again, pathways, backwards design for our institutions, just to kind of sum up. Although we have our learning outcomes assessments fitting most neatly in Pillar 4, it absolutely impacts all of our areas. Service area outcomes, a critical component of all of the pillars, and many guided pathways initiatives can inform and support outcomes assessment. So data coaching, industry advisory groups, curriculum audits, which we are now going to hear about some examples at specific colleges. And so I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie.
All right, so I want to talk a little bit about our data coaching model, and I will say that we definitely didn't come up this by ourselves. We have amazing colleagues throughout the state who've really helped us out on this. So Santa Monica has helped us out. I know Saracosa is doing a data coaching program. So one of the great things about our system is that we don't have to do things alone, and people are willing to share information and share support on things. And one of those things was our data coaches. And what we found out was when we were doing guided pathways, not only in Pillar 4, but all of our pathways, was that we had a lot of data. We didn't know how to use it. We didn't know how to read it, and we didn't know how to disaggregate it to look at the specific populations that we needed to do. And so what we've done is we've created this data coaching model. And we also have pathway success teams, which I'll talk about a little later. But what we really wanted to do is facilitate this data analysis discussions. And it's both qualitative and quantitative data, which I think is really key. We wanted somebody to be able to appear, because I don't know about you guys, but we have a very small institutional research department. There are colleges out there have huge ones where you can actually get an institutional researcher come and talk to you. It's not that way at my campus. We need to have somebody who can help us out locally and who understands our classes, understands our programs, and can support us. So we've created 7 data coaches for each one of our pathways. And their job is to work with their success team, but actually look at the data, facilitate data discussions, looking at different outcomes from different courses, helping people facilitate the conversation about those. Because in our program review process, we've asked people like, what's going on with the gender gap in your classroom, in your classes? And they'd say, oh, well, we have a gender gap. And we're like, okay, but what does that mean? Is it disaggregated? How are we looking at different things? And nobody could get into that deeper level discussions about data. It was just more of a surface level. And as we go through, we want to make sure that we actually have those opportunities to have those discussions. And so we have these new data coaches. They're brand new. We just started them this year. But they can coordinate with the programs, they can coordinate with the counseling, they can coordinate with everybody. So it's a cross-functional discussion rather than just the individual faculty member looking at their data and only looking at their data. So it's taking that data, having the facilitating discussions about that data, but also bringing it out into a larger scale. I will say that ours is part of the new program review process, which I'll also be talking about later. And ours data coaches are required to take a 4-week class specifically on how to analyze data, how to discuss data with somebody, how to look at data through an equity lens, and how to disaggregate data and make it meaningful. And so it's really important to have that background to be able to have those conversations. So I just want to highlight that as an effective way to bring more people into the discussion of outcomes and how we can, as a group, look at those ideas and have somebody facilitate those conversations with us, because as we know, it's hard to facilitate conversations on data if you don't have that background.
Can you clarify the extent to which that includes outcomes data versus achievement data?
We do a little bit of everything. Right now it's focused on outcomes data because they're facilitating mostly program review support. So they are looking at that and the SLO support, but they're also looking at bigger data as well. And they're looking at, when I show you guys the support teams, the nice thing is that you have a data coach, a counselor, and a lead faculty member and some other people in the same room together. So they can talk about the outcomes data, but then they can also talk about the data of things that are going to affect that outcome data, like the support from counseling and some of those other areas as well. Yes, I got a question here about reassign time. Yes, they do get reassigned time. That's one of the things our Guided Pathways money is going to, which we're going at theirs, they get 3 to 4 hours a week as part of this process. And they can either take it as overload or as load, depending on what they want to do. Yeah. And the class, who teaches the class, I'll put that as well. We have a math instructor who just happens to be our program review and SLO coordinator right now. So it works out really nice. She and the equity coordinator created the class together. And they ran the course together. So we had specifically like, how do you do data? And then how do you do data in an equitable framework? And I took the class just because I was interested in it, even though I'm not a data coach, and it was absolutely fascinating. So we're hoping to open the class. We did it in the summer. We're hoping to open the class open again to anybody who wants to take it, who might want to be a data coach in the future.
Stephanie, I have a question. How would you describe the interrelationship between the data coaching and the institutional research team on your campus?
Right now, we have an interim researcher right now, so it's still tentative, but he's starting to meet with our data coaches regularly. They're starting to create dashboards together about what each pathway wants to have on a dashboard and things like that. So it's becoming much more of a partnership between our pathways and our institutional research. So it's still new and we're still working on it, but it's much more of a cooperation rather than us having to go to them every single time and say, we need this data. Wow. So it's more of a broadening of data opportunities and a further understanding of data. Wow. Yeah. Right. Oh, I just got a question about the data class. Would it be available to outsiders? We haven't decided yet. I'm hoping that we can create some sort of class that can be available to more people because it's a really good class. I will say that we took a lot of the information from Santa Monica and some of the other places as well. So they helped us with some of the examples and things like that. So we're not the only ones who've done this, but we are hoping to do something where we can open up a class to other people.
Yeah, and I will add that the Pathways Taskforce is working on some resources that include data, looking at data and interpretation of data that are still in process, but that we hope to have available to folks probably next year.
And then there was one question about resources using to come with potential interventions. I will say we're using the starfish data a lot, and we're looking at that because it does success scores and things like that we can use. It's using we do collect all the people that things attend in that. We're doing early alerts in that and some of those other things as well. And then we just use our MIS data for the other stuff. All right. Well, we can answer more questions later, but we'll want to get on to Jeffrey's next slide.
All right. Yeah, so this slide and the next are a couple of examples of integrating our processes, if within this guided pathways framework, and at the same time doing it in a way that is informing learning outcomes. So for example, one of the things that was actually emerged separately from our Guided Pathways effort was the organization of our CTE programs into industry sectors, but we never could really get that off the ground. And so our Guided Pathways facilitators, actually one in particular, really took a lead on this and was able to facilitate industry sector meetings in these areas. And you see the stakeholders involved, and included in this is, you know, as students, have a student perspective. And so part of what's happened is it kind of builds upon the work that's already hopefully informing program learning outcomes, the work in the CTE program advisories. But now what we're talking about is a cross-functional opportunity where you have related programs, you have multiple departments, you know, that have shared interests. And through this effort, you learn even more about the sort of skills and other things that are being looked at by the industry that can inform the learning outcomes. And yeah, so this is, I think, one very promising effort. And this, of course, also aligns, it intentionally was made to align with the strong workforce framework in terms of industry sectors as well. So it's a really good overlap of sorts. And we've just launched it this past fall, actually summer and fall, and where the second round is in store for the spring. But yeah, they're looking at things that really how to better situate the programs for job placement is, I think, next on the horizon. Hopefully we do find opportunities or learn of opportunities with respect to internships as well. So I know that question had come up. I think it's pretty, oh yeah, so it involves, I should, one last point is that what they're looking at is outcome data as well as achievement data. So it's kind of a combination of stuff too, as similar to what you heard earlier. So next slide. So one of the things that we're doing at East LA College that again is informing learning outcomes, and in this case, particularly at the course level, is a cultural curriculum audit, borrowing from the idea from Long Beach State College, which was presented at the Curriculum Institute this past summer, 2020. We've incorporated elements of our community of practice teaching and learning series that our Guided Pathways facilitator focusing on professional development at conducted this past summer as well. So we've turned into a semester long course, and it provides an opportunity for instructors to look at their own data. And this includes learning outcome data as well as the achievement data, and to look for gaps at the same time that they're getting instruction on culturally responsive teaching, on equity, on anti-racism. And so the idea then through the cultural curriculum audit is instructors are in a sense empowered, right, to address equity challenges that are occurring in their classrooms. Now, this first semester that we're launching it in spring, the marketing was open, and we're going to continue to market to get participants from as many departments as possible. Hopefully, down the road, this will transform into a train the trainer model. But the other piece of what we're hoping to do is as we continue our work with our meta major completion teams, we call them our CAP teams for the Career and Academic Pathways moniker, is that they will, with their data coaches, be looking at equity gaps in the pathways in their respective areas, and then be able to initiate dialogue, right, for certain disciplines, you know, like make sure people are informed, and at the same time, you know, help provide awareness of this opportunity to address it. This is not about policing people. This is about providing, you know, more insight and more support. Yeah, so that's yeah, so it's I'm really excited about this undertaking.
Mhm.
Oh yeah, you know, I have a rough like generic template. I'll see if I can look for that and upload it into the chat later. Yeah, I'll have to look for it a little bit, but I think I'm able to find it. that was an answer to that question. Are there any other questions related to either of these undertakings?
I see
Oh,
in the
well,
chat.
so the
there you
question
go.
about the example of equity gap in the pathways, as I said, that's going to be developing. But the whole idea is to see, are there perhaps certain courses, for example, where students are having a difficulty completing, and then looking at that data, disaggregating it, and then see, oh shoot, this is primarily affecting students of color, and maybe it looks like it's affecting our Black students or Latinx students, and so the point is, or women, there's ways in which you can look at the data and then say, oh well, let's look at what we can do differently, perhaps. And again, this is not a silver bullet magic pill sort of thing, but it provides opportunities and resources for instructors who want to be aware of this and be able to explore alternatives. Mhm.
Yeah, and I would say one of the other things that we're looking at in equity gaps for pathways is who's in those pathways, who chooses those pathways. Because when we're looking at our child development program and our things like that, it's overwhelmingly women and it's overwhelmingly low income. And so how do we, create systems where people can have those conversations and make informed decisions on what areas they want to do. Now the child development is amazing. We want to make sure that students have opportunity for every pathway if they want to. And
Yeah,
also,
and
the gender gap in CTE and some of those other things.
And just to add to all this discussion, I think when we're talking about data and we're talking about the analysis of data, right, to the earlier question, we always want to be looking at achievement data in some kind of context, using that good qualitative data that outcomes assessment can provide to us. Not always, sometimes we get quant, right? But if we get both, then if we see a gap in that achievement data, then we can turn through programs like this to our outcomes assessment data in order to give it some context, to try to understand what we see happening in that achievement data, right? Because just the gap in the achievement data by itself is not necessary. It's not going to be an explanation. And so then you need all of this good context where instructors are empowered to investigate that data, to make changes to their curriculum if that's necessary, to have good conversations about it, right? So that the data is not punitive, so that it starts the conversation and doesn't end it, right?
Yeah. Right.
Okay, and so that leads us to the start of some of our questions that we wanted to kind of investigate and have dialogue with you all about as part of this session. And so the first one is about how integration of guided pathways and learning outcomes assessment can lead to strong and equitable learning outcomes for students. So how can that work or be effective? I mean, one of the things that I come back to all of the time is that outcomes, when we present them clearly and we align them to good curriculum and teaching practices, help promote deep learning for students, right? And that's particularly true for example, first-time students who maybe can't always intuit what it is that the instructor wants or needs, or why they might be learning content that they're learning, right? The reasons can seem opaque. Sometimes they seem opaque to me, right? To all of us. So of course they would to students. The more we can show them the reasons behind and the goals for their learning, the deeper that learning becomes, which is always kind of the goal, I think, for everybody, for faculty, right? We want that deep engagement with students. And so that kind of clarity is one way to help promote and fill equity gaps. And I know Stephanie has some additional examples for us.
So this is kind of aligned with the data coaches discussion that we had a few minutes ago, is that outcomes assessment takes holistic support. And that we've done for years where we've done outcome assessment in little pockets, like math looks at math and English looks at English, and the library looks at the library and things like that. But we've never really had cross-functional conversations about data and outcomes. And so one of the things we created was these success teams. And as you can see here, the data coach is a member of this big idea of a success team. And the idea is that you not only get the data in there, but you get the people who are interacting with that data together in a room together and have conversations. So we have, again, 7 success teams for each one of our pathways. We have a data coach, a lead faculty member, counseling lead, and a student navigator in every single one of the pathways. We're also adding intervention specialists, a dean, and then we also have an A&R and financial aid liaison for each one of the pathways. The idea here is that we can look at the data in less of a silo and more of a process, like how are we all going to help the students succeed in addressing this gap. The nice thing is also that because we're in pathways, we can see trends across multiple disciplines. And our success teams meet together with their own success teams, but they also meet with the other success teams. So again, we can look at some trend analysis across our different pathways and see if there's things that we need to make sure are done systemically as an institution, and some that are needed specifically in that individual pathway. And we're really excited about incorporating a student in here, because again, when we look at the data in isolation of what our students' actual lives are and realities are, we can often get I feel we can disenfranchise them on this type of thing. We need to bring them into the discussions. So we're really excited about this process. This entire team works together on the program review process and supporting faculty in that program review process, which we've completely redesigned recently. But again, this whole idea is that the student requires all of the college to succeed. And then how can we make sure that discussions are done through through the entire campus as we go through.
Do you have an example of like one thing that, like an example of a gap that the teams might have looked at? Like we have similar teams at my college, but we're really focused. This is the first year and it's focused on case management for disproportionately impacted students. And so we're not kind of looking at data and I'm trying to wrap my head around that piece.
I will say we have, they have just started this year, so we haven't got a lot of them. I will say that right now, the STEM pathway and the math, English, and arts pathway are looking at the low enrollment in math and English this year. And so looking at trends on that. So it's not necessarily an outcome assessment, but it's one of those big data gaps that we're seeing, and we're seeing, what students are not enrolling for math and English this year. How can we address that? And so the success teams are working together on that to kind of look at those data elements. Other ones, they just went through their first review of program review this year. Half the pathways went through program review this year. Half of them will go through next year. And so they're starting to look at the data in those and seeing what trends there are through that. So again, it's all new, but that's kind of what they're looking at. Yeah, we're also looking at access data and some of those other things as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so apologize for all the text on this one slide. a story to tell, and actually this is the edited down version. Of course, as you all probably who are involved with Guided Pathways are familiar with, that when we talk about the student's end goal in mind, we're talking about direct to career or transfer. And what we do in nearly all of our programs is really help students with soft skills that will help them succeed in achieving those end goals. And so Guided Pathways at our college, and I'm sure at other colleges, are designing instruction with that in mind. And interestingly, of course, that's always been embedded within our institutional and general education learning outcomes, right? And at our college, our Learning Assessment Committee each year at the end of the year has held what they refer to as these closing day events, where they look at the institutional level data, both in terms of our igloos or igloos, so to speak, and the achievement data. They analyze it, there's dialogue. And after a few years recently of doing this, they concluded that there's really a need to have more productive exploration, more meaningful and authentic student per student data that will enable examination for equity, right? And so this past fall, there was a dialogue about this and this idea of a Think 5 campaign. Really trying to recruit instructors who will, in a sense, select one of the institutional learning outcomes for part of an institution-wide assessment, um, in terms of how these students are doing with respect to these outcomes. Again, trying to have our course objectives aligned in this way, have agreeing to a universal rubric for this outcome, an assignment, and that's actually counts in terms of the course grade and authentic assessment, so that at the closing day, there'll be the ability to have a look at this in terms of you know at the same time that we're doing cultural curriculum audit, we're doing a number of other professional development activities in terms of anti-racism, in terms of equity. How what changes are we seeing, right? And this is really the start of a process. It's not thought of as a one-off. So I think this coming spring is really going to be the recruitment phase of it. But this is an exciting way of really trying to make use of the learning outcomes assessment to advance equity and to advance, again, help to refine the work we do with our institutional learning outcomes. Right, so it's really exciting. And again, this come about from the participation of our learning assessment team, and in particular our learning assessment coordinator, in the guided pathways work, and then seeing, well, how does that apply in our area? And so it's been, it's so much more wonderful outcomes, I think are in store from this undertaking. Are there any questions?
I see one in the chat, so I just want to briefly, Craig has asked, how are you generating outcomes data for pathways, and could you clarify the infrastructure a little bit? And I think probably Jeffrey or Stephanie may want to answer this one.
Well, I can answer with respect to this particular example. The emphasis is on the institutional learning outcomes, the institutional general ed outcomes. So we don't have a pathways-based outcomes approach. We have our course level, our program level, and our institutional general ed outcomes. I'm not sure Stephanie has a different answer.
I think we're starting with bigger, not necessarily student learning outcomes by pathway, but we're starting out by more like some of the achievement data by pathway. So we are starting to put dashboards together where you can disaggregate by pathway by students. So we just did one on like the number of people who registered by pathway, and which one, who's missing in which pathway, and who didn't register in which pathway. So we can kind of target communication to them about things. We're also starting to, in Starfish, which is what we use for a lot of our data, is we're identifying everybody by pathway in Starfish so that we can then take data out of Starfish and disaggregate it by pathway as we're moving that direction. So a lot of it is backside stuff to make sure that you can actually pull data from pathways, but we're starting to do that incrementally as we go forward.
One thing that I do have to say, and I see the example, thank you, Karen, for sharing that example of sampling. One of the things that I do have to say is that we've been very fortunate to have a lot of volunteer support, I think, across our programs. So it'll be really interesting to see how this new Think 5 campaign develops. I do believe it will, there'll be a complement, if you will, to the cultural curriculum audit, which again, we just have just launched, or launching this spring. We have like over 30, maybe 35 people signed up. But the goal is to ensure we have participation from each of our departments, ideally be each program, and then on top of that, we will be hoping to pursue targeted PD through the work of the CAP teams.
And so I just want to address the question here about getting to the point where, people don't see it as extra work to do outcomes. That is a huge undertaking. I was the first SLO coordinator on my campus many years ago. And I again was like, oh, we have to do something else. Like, why are we doing this type of thing? I don't think we've ever gotten to the point where people love doing outcome assessments, although it's sometimes fun with the data. But we've said is, this is something we have to do. This is something we want to do to support our students. And this is how we're going to support you in doing the work. So it's not necessarily something that they're really excited to do, but we're going to be making sure that we support you in everything you do. And we're also going to show you the outcome of what you do to change things. And so I think that's kind of been one of our things that we've been trying to do is more like, okay, we're going to change something. Let's talk about it and let's celebrate what you've done and also let you see the results of what's going on.
Yeah.
So yeah.
If I can just add briefly to that, I think the example of the kind of project that Jeffrey is talking about is a good way to get at some of that. If you can couple your assessment work really directly with instructional professional development and like classroom work, faculty tend to be more invested in it. We're doing something similar with our institutional learning outcomes, where we've kind of offered a hybrid of like professional development around whatever the outcome is, like teaching critical thinking, right? Let's talk about teaching critical thinking and have some workshops, and then also develop an assignment that you're going to use to assess it. And then also let's look at some student work that people did in response to those assignments and have some conversation about it. The tack I tend to use is that the reporting will come, right? The reporting will take care of itself if you are doing good, meaningful work. And you just have to report it. And that's the part everyone hates, right? It's the like box checking and the assessment management systems and all the rest of it. So as much as I can decouple from the sort of reporting aspect of it and just say, let's focus on instruction and like, how can we improve that instruction? And then once you do that good, meaningful work, let's report it. And I'll help you do that part. Right? But this is the part over here that matters. And I find that tends to help, although it's a slow kind of building up process, right? You start these projects with your champions sometimes, and then you do that train the trainer model and you get folks invested and you move it out, right?
Yeah, and I would say that, and I'm not sure how things are playing out at every college. But I suspect at every college that there is amongst quite a number of faculty a genuine interest in doing what they can to advance equity and inclusion, and the idea that they could use learning outcomes assessment to do that is something that I think helps to validate their desire to create changes where they can to help their students, and at the same time helps to get us at that desire for meaningful, authentic learning outcomes assessment work.
I think it's key to this, that data literacy. Because if you look at the data and you understand it and you understand that there's huge gaps there, how can you not respond to those? And so that often helps. But if you just like hand them a whole bunch of data and say like, oh, here, figure it out. No, but if you have somebody walk through the data with you and say, look, it looks like you have an equity gap here. What's going on here, or what's going on here? They're much more likely to be engaged in the conversation.
So I'm going to go ahead and move us forward so we don't run out of our time. And I'm going to speed through some of these last couple of questions so that we can get to maybe a little bit more discussion, because the discussion parts have been great. Thank you all for your good questions. So first, just briefly, how can Guided Pathways help us re-envision assessment as student-centered? And I think the main thing, and we'll talk about this in a moment with program review, is just to include your students in your assessment processes, right? Do you have a student rep on your O&A committee? When you are doing these big pathways initiatives, how are you including students and their voices? So just in a quick example from my college, we've been working on our meta majors development. We are very close, a couple of weeks, hope for me as we go through governance, right? But we had students that we invited specifically, and we got a van to take them to the location to come to all of our meta majors summits. And they had some of the best feedback for us about, what the project should look like and how it should work. Once we had a big draft together, we did a sort of assessment survey, almost like a user testing, where we sent it to them and we said, try to find your major and give us feedback. And like 700 plus of them filled out this electronic survey with no incentive or anything. They were so excited about it, right? And we got some of these great comments. You could see one of them here. But again, just be always considering where can the student voice be built into your process so that you don't lose it later. Like qualitative data collection, student feedback on your assessment results, results or your program reviews, student representation on all of your governance committees, and not just representation, but how do you like train and include the student reps that you do have? Because I think sometimes we sort of cycle through those reps and we don't necessarily bring them in to the conversations the way that we should do, right? And they get kind of scared and they don't come back to the meetings because they're full of jargon and things. So like what kind of procedures do you have set up for that? And then I'm gonna zip right along because I know Stephanie has some good examples related to program review. So reviewing or adapting your existing assessment practices. This is the big motherlode question, which is why I wanted to get to it, to create a culture of learning and improvement. This is what we're all sort of always aiming for, right? How do we get that good culture of assessment on our campus? And we talked a little bit about it a moment ago in response to the good question. And one of the ways is to think about student-centered program review practices. So I want to let Stephanie talk about that.
Okay, so as part of our ongoing process, we talked about a program review as part of our program review, our part of our guided pathways process. And what we realized was that we had a 5-year process. Everybody wrote 100+ pages. It sat on a shelf for 5 years and nobody looked at it. Right. And so we had a discussion about like, okay, what is program review and outcome assessment actually do? And what do we want it to tell us? And so I will say that we actually stopped our entire processes for 1 year. And we said, nope, we're not going to continue on with this. We're not going to just routinely go through this type of thing. We're going to sit down. We're going to ask ourselves, what do we want out of this? And how can we support students by doing it? And so we actually spent an entire year looking at that. And what we've done is we've redesigned our entire program review process and how the outcomes are aligned in there. It's now a 2-year process now. It's much shorter. It's much more responsive to what we want to do. It includes student data in there and different things like that, because we actually took the time to stop and say, why are we doing this? And that's kind of that guided pathways framework of like, we've been doing this thing on routine for years and years and years. And we've just been doing it because, and when your time came up, you wrote the 100 pages, you turned it in and you got a checkbox saying, yep, I did it. Or you did your assessments every year in the spring because your assessment coordinator emailed you and said, you still need to do your assessments. So you like put in, okay, yes, they did 70%. They were fine. They're good. Let's go. And it became much more routine and not actually meaningful. So we actually spent that time talking about what could we make it meaningful. And we use that guided pathways model of designing with the end in mind to create what we wanted to look like and how we wanted to use it. And this is where a lot of our support team stuff came out, our data coaches came out, and some of those other things, because we realized we couldn't do that without that support. And so as we're doing these changes, as we institutionally, as we go across, we're also building in the supports and the opportunities for dialogue to make sure that these things are effective and useful. So I won't go through the whole slide, but I just want to kind of highlight those specific ideas. Mm-hmm.
All right, and I got us here. So we have 5 minutes, I think, left of our hour, so that we can take some questions. But I also want to highlight for you just a few resources that we have available. So a couple of items that were referenced in the talk, and then the Chancellor's Office has their Pathways Resource Library, as well as the State Senate, where you can find lots and lots of great resources, including a terrific Canvas course that we have been building out around guided pathways and around many of the topics that we've been discussing here. So I encourage everybody just to kind of check those out. I'll also highlight Ruth Ann has in the chat a link for you to go do a survey about this presentation if you like. So hey, give us that assessment, right? Let us know how we did.
And I think assessment coordinators will actually do the survey.
Yeah, right. Now we want
won't,
questions. So
yeah,
please do just raise your hand. Any questions or comments that you would like to add for us today?
While people are waiting for questions, I just want to highlight that in the Guided Pathways resources is probably there's some really great information in there about program review processes and making it student-centered. So there's some templates, some examples, some discussions, and there's a great webinar that I know Sarah did a couple months ago about program review processes, which is a great resources.
Yeah, and a thing I'll highlight from that is just particularly, again, for outcomes assessment folks, if you can get the assessment incorporated into your program review, it's a really wonderful way to make meaning out of that work, because now suddenly if folks can draw on their outcomes assessment data and information, whether that's qualitative or quantitative, in order to support requests that now have like funding tied to them and other things, right, it becomes much more meaningful to do that work. So if you can kind of tie your assessment data to your program review requests, people are much more likely to kind of find that meaning, right?
Well, and the other thing is that the reason I love the Guided Pathways framework is it gives us the permission to ask why. Why are we doing this? Why are you doing this? Why? And ask for data and analysis and have a group conversation about why and how can we make this meaningful? And I think that was all the underline of outcomes assessment in the first place. Like, why are we doing this? And is it making an impact? And I think Guided Pathways has given us kind of that permission to take that model and expand it to everything we do.
Vivian, I see, has asked, with program review every 2 years, do you also do an annual plan? So Vivian, I think a lot of colleges handle the cycle differently. I know at our college we do annual program review, but not everyone does. So Stephanie, if you want to speak to that.
We do an annual budget plan every year, but we don't do an annual plan every year for, we do recommendations in the program review for every 2 years. We did an annual plan every year to do your SLOs, but we haven't decided yet how that's going to be done, because again, it was something that we did and then nobody did anything with it. So we're still asking why and how we can do that and make it more effective, so that we can get responsive on that. Because again, it was just like, we fill out this form every year and what do we do with it? It goes on Canvas or at the time Blackboard, and we don't do anything with it. So it was that kind of discussion of like, okay, what do we do with it? And if we get, so we actually have a group right now that is a task force of our budget committee and our program review committee that are actually looking at how we can report outcomes from our program review into our budget. And so they're going to be making recommendation, again, asking why are we doing what we're doing, and is it effective? Okay. We have an assessment style schedule for program review. It's every 2 years, and we do half of our programs each year. We're changing our SLO assessment cycle, which used to be a 5-year cycle. According to our program review, we're changing it to a 2-year cycle now. And we're actually having discussions about, let's look at our outcomes and ask, are they relevant? Are they giving us actual data that we can use? And things like that. So it's all aligning into kind of this tidal wave of change, which is great, but it makes people a little nervous and it makes people a little anxious. But I think with our program review process going so well and not requiring people to write hundreds of pages every couple of years, I think people are more open to change.
Yeah. So Karen also has a cycle
Yes.
question.
Yeah, our course, we were discussing that right now, is whether every course needs to be assessed within the 2 years. Our estimation is yes, but we're going to see if we can reduce the number of outcomes for each one of those courses to being very meaningful, and then have them change the outcomes more often as needed. But again, that's a bigger discussion we're still having.
Yeah, and again, I think it depends on your campus and what your cycles are, right? Everybody has different processes for these things. So we're on a 3-year cycle for our outcomes. And what that means primarily is that each outcome that's attached to the course or program should be assessed at least once every 3 years. And then we give people a lot of flexibility in how they want to kind of handle that. So some folks will do, their course has 3 different learning outcomes and they do them all at once. Some people might choose one every year and do an assessment of it, right? Depends on the size of the department, how many sections of the course they have, all those kinds of little things that I know everyone is always kind of dealing with. So we try to be flexible. We may look at that cycle again pretty soon, because it doesn't align really neatly with all of our other ones. But like Stephanie, that's going to be a process down the road a little bit for us, I think.
Well, I think the other thing is it's never done.
Yeah.
Like, even if we start something, it's still going to be evolving. And that's the other thing with Guided Pathways, is it's never done. Which again makes some of us a little anxious, but that's what it should be. It should be this evolving discussion of how it can be effective and how students can be supported in it.
Okay. So we're at time, and I want to respect everybody's time. So I want to just say thank you to all of us all of you for joining us today. Thank you to Jeffrey and Stephanie, who are wonderful. And if you
Sarah.
have follow-up questions for us, I'm going to put my email in the chat.
I will too.
Feel free to send us an email, or again, to check out those links on the statewide Senate related to the Guided Pathways Task Force, and you can contact us there. You can also request services from us at the state website if you like, and we will do campus visits and all kinds of things. So
that's right. And and don't forget to save the chat.
Yes. Right. And take the survey.
And do the survey. Right. All right. And we'll hang around for a couple of minutes in case people have questions as you go to your next session. So thank you all so much. And I'm going to stop the recording.